Welcome to the inaugural episode of Hooked on Hoops presented by Triple Threat Collectibles, Nothing But Net Basketball Magazine's new weekly podcast. My name is Patrick Straw Pratt. I, along with NBN Magazine's editor-in-chief and Pango's president Dinos Trigonis, are your co-hosts. This podcast will be a no-holds-barred, entertaining but serious discussion of important issues related to today's high school, college, and pro basketball environment. Dinos?
Great to have you, Pat. Looking forward to this. We've been talking about a podcast for a long time here. A lot of people were looking forward to us coming on and talking about recruiting and other basketball issues. I'm glad we got it off the ground.
Yes, sir. Welcome along the journey. Now, Frank Burlison is a well-regarded longtime basketball writer who was inducted into the U.S. Basketball Writers Association Hall of Fame in 2005 and is an original member of the McDonald's All-American Game Selection Committee. Frank has worked for the Long Beach Press-Telegram, Fox Sports, and has operated his blog, BurlisonOnBasketball.com, a national high school scouting service for decades. His opinions on the potential high school and college players are widely respected and has long been sought by college coaches, NBA scouts, personnel directors, and general managers from coast to coast for 50 years. Welcome to the podcast, Frank.
My pleasure, guys. Glad to join you.
All right, Frank, let's get it going here. Big announcement this morning. Brayden Burries, one of the big prizes of 2025 class, that is, popped for Arizona. Landmark get for Tommy Lloyd. Terrific senior year. Took his team, Roosevelt of Eastville, California, to the Tarkanian Championship. He took his team to the St. Damien Classic Championship. Took his team to the California CIF Open title, state title. The accolades go on and on. Frank, what does Brayden Burries to Arizona mean for Tucson and the U of A?
Well, Dinos, I think as you mentioned, you recited a lot of his accomplishments in the 2 years, well, actually 3 years. He was ineligible as a sophomore at Roosevelt after spending his freshman season at Riverside Poly. But last 2 years, I mean, people forget because of the accomplishments of Roosevelt, as you mentioned, that became the first team to win the Tarkanian Classic and the Damien Classic at Damien Platinum Division championships the same years. And the things he did is beyond belief in terms of top 5 at Pango's All-American Camp last June, top 5 at the NBA Players Association camp in June, and then I believe he was a top 5 selection for EYBL. So there's a guy who the last couple of years has been as good as any player in the country, and certainly capped it all with a state championship open run in California. And again, I think certainly the impact on the University of Arizona's team next season will be profound and immediate, with Caleb Love, who's multi-year All-American at both North Carolina and Arizona, departing. Certainly opens the door for him to step right in, which I think most people, including myself, believe he will. And I think the thing that separates Brayden Burries, and I think if you look at Koa Peat, who committed to Arizona about 4 or 5 weeks ago, led Perry High and Gilbert to 4 consecutive championship state titles. First player to ever do that, comparable to what Stanley Johnson did at Mater Dei 12, 13 years ago in California. And then I think if you look, to me, there's a nice parallel classes here, that by Duke in Arizona. And, a lot of teams are going to have McDonald's All-Americans on their rosters next season, and future lottery picks and future pros. And I think, Burries and Pete are that. But I think that this thing that separates Pete and Burries at Arizona, and the other example I'm going to use is Duke with Cameron and Caden Boozer, Miami, Columbus, and Nicholas Hamania, Harvard Westlake. When you look at those guys, it's a cliche, but when people call somebody a winner, but when you look at Burries at Roosevelt, Pete at Perry, what they bring to Arizona in terms of winning culture and focus on winning, and then what the Boozers and Hamania will bring to Duke, I think there's a good parallel, and I think what separates those guys is, they've been winners wherever they've gone in terms of winning championships. And I think they'll bring, another cliche culture, but I think they'll enhance that culture because certainly Duke and Arizona are two of the more successful programs in the last, 3, 4 decades or whatnot. And I think they'll carry over that, as opposed to, I think, a lot of other players who may be in this class as physically gifted as those guys are, but maybe don't have that same passion or focus on winning that the Duke and Arizona players from the class of 25 have.
Well, the one thing that struck out to me this year about Roosevelt, obviously, Burries was a key part of that team, but he had a very good supporting cast with Isaac Williamson, who's a Anderson Hunt type shooter, and Miles Walker, who was small in stature, huge in heart, making plays. But most people looking back kind of forgot about the adversity Burries and Williamson had coming from Riverside Poly, where they were ruled ineligible and they couldn't play varsity anywhere, even at Roosevelt, their sophomore years. And it kind of reminds me of a Tony Bennett comment a couple of years ago. Tony Bennett, Hall of Fame to be coach, won the national title the year before, was the first team was a number 1 seed that got knocked off by a number 16 seed. And having to endure that and come back the next year, kind of like Florida. People don't realize that Florida's hot right now. They were bounced in the first round last year. And Tony Bennett made a comment that resonates with me: make adversity your ally. And I saw a lot of that with Burries. As you know, they had nowhere to play with him and Williamson as sophomores. They came to my league at the end of the year, got a couple games in. You could tell they were a little dejected. And to see them bounce back and go through that experience makes them a tougher competitor and a tougher out at the next levels.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we talked about that because, again, out of sight, out of mind, people forget when Williamson, Isaac, and Brayden Burries were at Riverside Poly as freshmen in a season that was impacted by the COVID situation. It was the delayed season, if you will, playing in the spring. Those guys, I think, only lost to Damien in the Sunny Hills tournament, Centennial in a league game, and then to St. Bernard in the D1 playoffs. So these are two guys who were, they were going to leave Riverside Poly to a possible Southern Section championship at some point. And again, two very focused, driven kids who have great support systems at home with their families. They realized that you couldn't let what happened to them fairly happen to them at Riverside Poly in terms of their eligibility called into question, let that define them. They thought long and hard. They took a good approach. They focused themselves on what they had to do. They selected an outstanding program at Roosevelt with Coach Steve Singleton, who obviously had a relationship, who's had outstanding teams. He'd already coached a state title team at Dominguez as an interim coach with Tyson Chandler, and then I think 217 had won a D1 state title. So they went to a right program. They didn't let that year off put them in too much of a funk. They stayed focused, as you mentioned, Dinos. As soon as you started your spring league in that spring of 2023, they jumped right aboard, showed that they were quality players, got their names out there, and had good spring and summers on the club scene, and then carried it over. And again, both outstanding a year ago as juniors at Roosevelt, and outstanding. Both were outstanding at your Pangos All-American camp in Vegas, along with Miles Walker, their teammate who came from MLK and Riverside. So again, they're prime examples of these days when people tend to quit or claim woe is me or whatever, and look for excuses and get bitter. They didn't get bitter; they got better. I hate to coin a cliche, but classy players, classy families, and guys who's Burries at Arizona and Williamson now wherever he ends up with him decommitting at New Mexico
Yeah,
and the
most definitely.
Speaking of their classy families, we can also note how Miles Walker's dad was the starting point guard for the LMU team with Bo Kimball and Hank Gather. So he
Yeah,
has that
and
leadership
again,
DNA in him.
not only that, Patrick, but as Dinos knows because he was at the school at the time, but Billy Walker, who was at the same backcourt in the late '80s at Long Beach
Long
State
Beach
with,
State, yeah.
Moreland Wiley. He was the first, the point guard for the first Joe Harrington, Seth Greenberg year at the Long Beach State program. So,
Right.
and Williamson's dad and Burries' dad were also outstanding players and good basketball minds who don't see, like I say, they don't tend to, like most parents or grandparents or whatnot, tend to be try to blow smoke people's butts or whatnot and not have a good focus. But they were at times their son's own worst critics in terms of not let them relax or thinking they had it made and driving them to always be better. So, props to the family, as you said, props to the families as well as the kids for closing out quite the run at Roosevelt.
We mentioned Florida earlier. They're obviously coming off a great Final Four with their Doogie Howser head coach, Todd Golden, the new kid on the block, youngest head coach to win a title since Jimmy Valvano in 1983. Ironically, it was against the same team, Houston.
Yeah, that's right.
Lightning strikes twice for the youngest coaches. But Todd did a great job, and that defensive pressure at the end, they kind of flipped the script on Houston, and they were the ones that were applying that defensive pressure down the stretch, and Houston couldn't get a shot off. It seemed like the last couple minutes.
What's interesting, Dinos and Patrick, is again, you forget about that. You forget about, the longer you, like certainly me, the longer you go, you forget how it's sort of like when you were in fourth or fifth grade and your teachers seemed like they were about 60. And when you look back and they were about 23 or 24, but I saw a chart of the youngest coaches to win national titles, and Bob Knight was 35 years old in 76 on that great, Scott May, Kent Benson, Quinn Buckner, Bobby Wilkerson, Tom Abernathy team. And you just forget Knight, a guy who's, maybe it was because of his personality or whatever, he always seemed 50 or 60 to me. And yeah, there he was, his first national title. The year before, they would have probably won it too, which was Wooden's last year. But Scott May broke his arm in a regional final against Kentucky. If he wouldn't have broken his arm, they would have won that game and probably won back-to-back national titles.
Hey, Frank, who in your opinion were the stars of this Final Four? Obviously, Cooper Flag had a tremendous game, but they kind of had a bad last part of that game. Who were the unsung heroes of this Final Four?
Well, I mean, you brought them up. You'd hate to throw it, on the coaches, because certainly the coaches only can put players in positions to succeed. But when you look what Todd Golden did with this Florida team, and again, I think Clayton probably played himself into a position to be possibly a first round pick. Who knows? Going into the season, nobody spoke of Walter Clayton being, a guy who could potentially be an All-American and lead his team to a national title, but he did that. But I think, Todd Golden, as you said, Dino's at age 39, obviously a real Kyle Smith and Randy Bennett roots, worked with both those guys before. And what he did, coming from behind, his last UConn, obviously, and obviously
they
Auburn.
Were down 12 there in the early second half.
Yeah, to all three of those teams they played, their last three wins were all games in which they had significant deficits in the second half. So props to him, props to what Kelvin Sampson's done with that Houston program, and probably, in the last couple of minutes, what they did, 9 down with a little more than 2 minutes to go, I think. And I think Duke had the ball, but certainly that was good again. And I think, Cooper Flag, if he hits that turnaround jumper and they hold on and beat Houston and then win a national title, we're talking about, one of the great Michael Jordan kind of freshman year when he led Carolina to a championship. But again, I think Flag obviously didn't hit some shots down the stretch, but I don't think anybody would say that Flagg was a disappointment either in the tournament or on the season when you consider the immense hype and expectation he came into the season with, getting Duke to the Final Four and doing what he did and accomplishments and demonstrating that he's far and away the best, in my humble estimation, maybe the best American-born NBA draft pick since Anthony Davis, somebody like that. So I think, and he won all the major awards, Wooden and Naismith. So I get, you tend to only remember who wins those last second games. In this case, Florida certainly was worthy of the incredible run they had and the way they did it.
I didn't like that call they made, that loose ball foul and that missed free throw on Cooper Flagg. I thought that was a cheap call.
Yeah,
you don't call
but
that
again,
like
if you want to do that, then if you watch that, that tough jumper, I think it was against what's his name, number 13 or whatever. That was as bad a hook on an offensive drive.
Well, I was at the semifinals, Frank, on Saturday, and from where I was, that was one of the most physical games, Auburn, Florida. Physical games I've ever seen.
That was one of the more, again,
hard to call games, man.
Unlike
and you're dealing with guys that should be playing 24-hour fitness and not in the NCAA.
But again, if you look at that Flagg hook, for God's sakes, that was like Michael Jordan's shove off on Brian Russell that before he had that winning shot. But again, hey, I think with replays these days, they show that the refs, for the most part, do a heck of a job. Remember that first half? I thought about it, and again, who knows if it really mattered? But if you guys were watching live and they showed the replay, there was a defensive goaltending that should have given Houston another basket in the first half that they didn't allow, and replay certainly showed that the Florida kid's hand was on the ball when the ball was definitely in the center. But again, hey, Houston on Saturday and Florida on Saturday and Sunday made the plays when it counts. So,
hey, Frank, I was a little bit disappointed. Kelvin Sampson overdue for a title, one of the most respected coaches that I know. I mean, what he did with this year's team, 34, 35 wins. I don't think there's an NBA player on that starting five.
No.
He won with toughness. He won the way he's always won. And he was right there, and it would have been great to not only have him get his first title, would have been the first ever Native American to win an NCAA title, which would have been a great thing as well. So let's go on. Let's transition here to the recruiting, because we got a few minutes left here. The recruiting is not much left. Obviously, the transfer portal is making a big impact on the high school recruiting scene, but there are some quality guys on the board right now. Some have decommitted because of coaching changes or otherwise. Others have been under-recruited, like Walter Clayton was a 0-star recruit.
Yeah.
And there are some guys out there that I think have the skill and the toughness to help teams win.
Well, as you say, we talked just about strictly in Southern California. You mentioned before we went on air, Elsie Harrington from St. John Bosco, tremendous 4-year player for the Braves. I guess just made it official that he was decommitting from USC. Outstanding guard, great student. Both parents are physicians, of course. We talked about Isaac Williamson from Roosevelt, tremendous defender and jump shooter who had originally signed with New Mexico, but when that staff moved on to Xavier, he got his release, and I think he's going to visit. He and his family will visit UNLV Sunday, and then Hudson Mays from Redondo, who had a great senior year. When the Central Michigan coach, Tony Barbee, was fired, he got his release. So I think he's going to be visiting, among others. I think he'll be at New Mexico for a visit next week, too. And then Miles Walker, a guy who's, when you talk about Roosevelt, kind of been the forgotten guy. But, we if you want to compare Williamson to Isaac Williamson to Anderson Hunt on those 90s UNLV teams, Miles Walker reminds me to Mark Wade, the great Banning High.
Mark Wade.
Left-handed dynamic point guard.
Also a lot of resemblance to Casper Ware, Bibbins.
Certainly. Certainly a dynamic player, and my guess is somebody, college coaches, the D1 programs aren't that. Once they get their snouts out of that portal and start looking at all these outstanding high school players available, I think you're going to see a
And
lot of.
some of these coaches are so deep into the portal, you think it was porn. They were so deep in there.
You sound like somebody who knows a little bit about porn, there, Dinos.
And I don't take any expert
So
credit.
you've heard, So you've heard,
I'm just saying. Now let's talk about two other guys, California roots. I like, played for my team. I'm kind of partial to them. They're both post grads. They're older now, obviously. Kendall Sanders, he's taking an unofficial visit to Utah this Saturday out of St. Bernard High School. Dad played at USC for George Raveling. Yaman Sanders, he seems like he's grown another inch or so. He's pushing 6'8". He's big and strong. Had a great year at IMG for Jimmy Carr. Another guy who's very undervalued, multiple position player. Also Bay Area native, Kenyon DeMunick, who's at Link post-grad in Missouri. One of the top run and jump athletes in the country. Needs to put on some strength, but he's got tremendous long-term potential. There's guys out there, I think, that could fit certain needs, and I think it's time for these coaches to not necessarily withdraw from the portal, but start taking a look at guys elsewhere that could fit what they're doing. Because they're not going to get people out of the portal.
I think a lot of it, Dinos, is, we both know some of the great, from Seth Greenberg to, a ton of guys who did still do a great job of evaluating players. But I think, there's going to, at some point, there's going to be a fine balance, portal. It's like the NBA, the draft and free agency or trades. Well, you got to strike a good balance when you're roster building. And I think now, across the board in D1, NCAA, everybody's enthralled with the portal, and sometimes it's almost like there's some programs that would be more vested in a kid who maybe played 4 or 5 minutes a game at a low D1 program and just did okay, as opposed to taking somebody like a Miles Walker or a Hudson Mays or someone who was an outstanding high school player on a high level of high school basketball. So again, I think a lot of it comes down to coaches having their faith in their own ability to make decisions and trusting their own eyes instead of relying a little bit on hype or sheer numbers.
Well, Frank, I think the problem with the portal, I think it's not a bad thing if you do it strategically. Obviously, Florida did a good job at that. Houston just got a great pickup in Ricky Isaacs from Creighton. Pop. Our good friend Rick Isaac's son. He actually gives them an added score that they desperately needed this past weekend. He would have been if Houston has Rick Isaac's son, Ricky Pop Isaac last weekend, they win the national title. He can create his own shot. He would have got a shot off at the end. He would have created for himself or somebody else. That's a great example of a pickup. But a lot of these guys that are in the portal, Frank, as you know, they're coming from bad situations. They're cancers in many cases. They're not team players. You got to be careful what you ask for, because sometimes the portal is not a cure-all. In some ways, it can make your team worse or your program's culture worse as well. So it's a double-edged sword. You got to know how to use it. Speaking of recruiting at the high school scene, Frank, since we have a few minutes left here, let's talk about the loaded California class of 2026. And obviously, we've had some great ones the last 25 years. 97 comes to mind. 2001 comes to mind with Tyson Chandler and those guys. The 2008, Brandon Jennings, Drew Holiday, DeMar DeRozan comes to mind. How would you put this class up in comparison with those? And who do you like both as slam dunks, as sleepers too, coming out of the 2026 class?
Well, I agree with you, Dino. This is the difference between is you guys what are you guys, class of 85 from Wilson?
85.
Yeah. Well, I'm the class, so I can I can go back and when initially, again, everybody has a pretty good feel for how old I am, but when we talk about the great classes, I think of 73 with Marcus Johnson and Clifton Pondexter in the West and Richard Washington, and 75 with Hamilton and Greenwood and Theus and James Hardy and Brad Holland and Flinny Ray Williams, and 79 with Michael Holden and Darren Day and all those great players. But again, I agree with you on all those classes you mentioned. I think the thing about the class of 26 is, even though there's, from Jason Crow Jr. to Elijah Reza.
There's something like the top five
Oh,
and 24/7. All five
I-
are from California, and we lost one in Elijah Arenas. This has to be
Yeah,
top heavy here.
I think, which is what, it takes me a while to get fired up for spring and summer basketball after a long regular season. But I think watching all these guys from the class of 20s, we talk about sleepers, and, we two guys who are veterans of your accounts, but Elias Obinia from Salesian, who's been down at your camp multiple times down in Long Beach
Captain
and in
EO.
Vegas, and, S.J. Madison, who had a great junior year for Redondo, and he's another one of those guys I
Reminds me a
remember.
little bit of Eddie Jones.
Yeah, a perfect, great analogy, body wise, and the way he plays. But again, another guy I think I saw first time as a seventh or eighth grader at Chervin. So I think it's a tremendous year. I think which is you're going to see a little more balance among the teams in Southern California next year, but also a class of 26 that's probably going to be 25 to 40 deep and surefire mid to high major players in Southern California alone.
Yeah, I kind of start with the top tier of Tyron Stokes, Brandon McCoy, Taj Ariza, Christian Collins, and Crow, no particular order. That's my top tier at the moment. Then you have that second elite tier, guys like Brandon Martinson, Julius Price, Caton Bailey, Max Adams, S.J. Madison, who you mentioned, Luke Barnett, one of the best shooters we've seen in quite some time, Joe Sterling, another primetime shooter, Isaiah Rogers.
Slim Rogers coming back.
He can fill it up. Then we got Obenia, we talked about, Andrew Hillman, Miles Jones.
Well, you know what, Dino? We can even go even further. When you talk about sleepers, you don't need anybody to pat you on your back. When you've got those long arms, you could do it yourself. But think back to your spring league and your spring events and you look at Asen Jimenez from La Habra, point guard, tremendous point guard, and Tyler Lopez, who was the sixth man on the Los Alamitos team that won CIF Southern Section D1 this year. Those are two guys who I think are
Josiah
really
Johnson from Mayfair too.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Great point guard whose parents played at Long Beach State. So I think it's a deep. The more we talk about, we're going to bring up other names, but it's a deep class, not only regionally but in Southern California. It's going to be a heck of a spring and summer just to watch how these guys do at the various events, including the Pangos All-American Camp, June 1st to 3rd, Bishop Gorman High in Las Vegas.
Oh yes,
you going to be there, Dinos?
I think I might be. That might if I get out of the my usual hot spot early enough.
Yeah, if you show up in the gym early enough.
Well, Frank, it was a pleasure having you on our inaugural podcast here with me and Dinos. Nothing but net basketball. And
hey, who you guys need to have as a special guest? Coach Fergie.
Yes,
Coach Fergie's there.
If he ever answers his phone, my high school, our high school coach, Jim
Coach Ferguson, baby.
Ferg.
Who always had plenty of words to the wise.
Varsity, let's go.
Well, Frank, thanks for coming on. Appreciate having you. I'm sure we'll have you back on soon. And
Looking forward to it, guys.
Good chance. Talk
Take care,
basketball.
See you on the sideline.
Hooked on hoops.
Hooked on hoops.